Hello everyone, I welcome you all to my channel Revealing Concepts. Today we are going to start with a new series for the chapter Geography. I'll be covering different topics from the NCERT textbook of class 6th to class 12th. Now these topics would be comprehensively covered and they won't be specifically for a certain standard, but yes, you can refer them depending upon the names of the topics that have been mentioned in the title of the videos. So let's start. The first thing that we are going to learn in today's video is about the interior of the earth, and in that specifically we are going to learn about the structure of earth's interior. So this is part 1 of interior of the earth, and in that we are going to see how exactly our earth's interior looks like. So this is a two-dimensional representation of our earth's interior. Of course, I have tried it showing in the form of a 3D figure, but since it is drawn on a plane, of course it looks like a 2D image. So here if you see, our earth is mainly divided, the interior of the earth is mainly divided into 3 parts. We have the crust, we have the mantle, and then we have the core. So this part is the crust. Then beneath the crust we have the mantle, and then we have the core. Now each of the crust, mantle and the core, they are further subdivided into two divisions. Like our crust, which you can see, it is divided, or it has 2 types. We have the oceanic crust and the continental crust. As the name suggests, oceanic crust is basically the crust that is beneath the water or the ocean water, and continental crust is basically the earth where we actually have our mountains or our houses or anything like that. So here if you see, the height or the width of the continental crust is about 34 kilometers and that of the oceanic crust is 5 kilometers. Together they form the crust part of our earth, and it is almost 1% of mass of our earth. So the crust forms 1% of mass of our earth, and it is of 2 types, the oceanic crust and the continental crust. Now let us move on to the mantle part of it. The mantle is further divided into 2 parts. The upper one is called as the upper mantle, whereas the lower one is called as the lower mantle. The total length of the mantle or the height of the mantle is 2,900 kilometers, and it is almost 68% of mass of our earth. And lastly, we come to the core part of our earth, which is the most interior part of our earth. Now the core is again divided into 2 parts, where this upper portion is called as the outer core, and the almost the one which is in the interior, the last one, is called as the inner core, where our outer core is 2,200 kilometers in length, whereas our inner core is 1,250 kilometers in length. So to sum up this entire figure, we have seen that our interior of the earth is divided into 3 parts. We have the crust, we have the mantle, and then we have something called as the core. The crust is of 2 types, oceanic crust and the continental crust. The mantle is again divided into 2 parts, the upper mantle and the lower mantle. And finally, we have the core that's divided into 2 parts, the outer core and the inner core. And this is what forms the structure of our Earth's interior. Now, there are 2 different terminologies that we use regularly, and what are those? So here if you see this crust part, okay, this is the part where actually where even normal people can understand or view the crust part of the earth, because the earth where we stand today is nothing but the crust part. It is like the solid part on where we stand, we erect our houses or different buildings, or where there are mountains, trees, etc. So the crust along with some part of upper mantle, crust along with some part of the upper mantle, which is actually very solid in nature, that part together forms the lithosphere. So whenever we use the term lithosphere, it is basically the crust, meaning the entire crust, which consists of the oceanic crust as well as the continental crust, plus the uppermost part of the upper mantle. So that is why our lithosphere composition, or you can say it is made up of crust plus the uppermost part of upper mantle. And the length or the height of lithosphere is about 100 kilometers. Similarly, we have the layer beneath the lithosphere in specific is called as a stenosphere. Now, what is this stenosphere? A stenosphere is basically the remaining part of the upper mantle and whose length is almost between 100 kilometers to 400 kilometers. So, now, why is this asthenosphere important? Asthenosphere is that part of the Earth's interior which is actually semi-solid, or it is in molten state, we can say, and this is the layer which is mainly responsible for volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. The movement that takes place in the interior of the Earth actually causes the semi-solid part that exists in the asthenosphere to come up to the lithosphere. So we have understood what is lithosphere and what is asthenosphere. Lithosphere is basically crust, the entire crust plus some part of the uppermost upper mantle, whereas just beneath it we have the asthenosphere. Now let's move on to specifically know what is crust, what is mantle, and what is core. So here if you see, this is the normal diagram for our crust, wherein this is, you can take this as the ocean, whereas this is where the mountains are placed. Now, of course, if this is 5 kilometers, it means that it is oceanic crust, and the 34 kilometers length wala part is the continental crust. Now, when you try to understand the compositions of these two parts, the continental crust and oceanic crust have different compositions, meaning there are different minerals that exist. The continental crust is made, or it mainly or majorly has two minerals, which are silica and aluminium, and that is why the name Sial. So we remember it by the mnemonic Sial, wherein Si stands for silica and Al stands for aluminium. So the rocks that are there in the continental crust, they mainly consist of minerals like silica and aluminium, whereas the oceanic crust is majorly made of sima, which is silica and magnesium. So here sima stands for silica and magnesium. That is how these two crusts actually differ in the combination, where our continental crust corresponds to Sial and oceanic crust corresponds to Sima. Now, it is also known by the researchers that the continental rocks are less, or you can say comparatively they are less denser than that of the oceanic rocks. So here we can say that the density of the continental rocks is always less than that of the oceanic rocks. And why that is so? Because the oceanic rocks actually have more pressure, or the water above the oceanic rocks exerts huge pressure on these rocks, and that is why they become more denser and denser. And that is why we can say that in terms of density, the continental rocks are less denser than the oceanic rocks, and that is why the oceanic rocks are more heavier than the continental rocks. Now let us move on to the mantle part of it. The mantle is divided again into two parts, as we have seen over there: the upper mantle and the lower mantle. The total length of the mantle, as we have seen, it is almost 2,900 kilometers, wherein your upper mantle, which also has a stenosphere in it, and as I have told you, a stenosphere is that part of the Earth's interior which has certain semi-solid, which is actually semi-solid in nature, and that is why we can say that our upper mantle is semi-solid. So it is in molten state, or the magma exists over here, whereas in the lower mantle, as we go down, as the pressure increases, we can say that this part again solidifies, and that is why our lower mantle is completely solid in state. So our crust, then we have our upper and lower mantle, where our upper mantle is semi-solid in nature and our lower mantle is solid in nature. Now let's move on to the core part. Again, the core is divided into two parts: the outer core and the inner core. Now The core entirely is made up of nickel and iron, and hence we can say, and hence the name knife, right? So nickel, Ni stands for nickel, and Fe meaning ferrous or iron. So our core is mainly composed of rocks which contain nickel and iron, and nickel and iron are majorly found in the outer core only. Now, the outer core is liquid in nature, whereas the inner core is solid in nature. And why is the inner core solid in nature? Because if you see, that is the last or the most deepest layer that exists in the interior of the earth. It actually has a lot of pressure that is coming up from the layers above it, and that is why the materials in the inner core are compressed with a large amount of pressure, and that is why this particular inner core is solid in nature. So we have seen that our whole interior of the earth has been divided into these 6 parts, wherein we can even understand the crusts as the outer crust and the inner crust. Outer crust is basically the part that we can see, and inner crust is thoda andar wala part. Then we have the upper mantle and lower mantle, and finally we have the outer core and inner core. Now, how did the researchers come up with these different layers? So what they did is, when they were actually researching and when they were understanding the interior of the earth, they saw that there is some transition that takes place when you move from one layer to another, and that is why they could figure out that yes, there are 2 different layers that exist. जब आप एक layer से दूसरे layer में जाते हो, how did you differentiate? So you differentiated it based upon certain change that happened suddenly. So that is why what they did is they tried to actually bring up the concept of discontinuity. Now, what does this discontinuity means? It is basically the transitioning of the layers of the earth's interior from one layer to another. For example, if you the first discontinuity that exists is the Conrad discontinuity. And what does this Conrad discontinuity indicates? It indicates that this is the line which actually is a transition line between the outer crust and the inner crust. So outer crust खत्म कहाँ पे होता है और inner crust शुरू कहाँ से होता है, वो line जो होती है, that basically is called as the Conrad discontinuity. Similarly, the transitioning line or the end part of our crust as a whole and the starting part of our mantle is denoted by the Moho discontinuity. And this is very important because this is actually the discontinuity which separates 2 major layers, the crust and the mantle. Then inside the mantle, the 2 layers of the mantle, that is the upper and the lower mantle, are separated by the Repetit discontinuity. Likewise, the mantle as a whole and the core is being separated by the Gutenberg discontinuity. And finally, the core, जिसमें 2 parts है, the outer core and the inner core, they are being separated by Lehman discontinuity. Now, how are you going to remember these discontinuities? So, for that, you first need to remember the order in which the earth layers are, the layers of the earths are divided. Now that is pretty simple. ऊपर crust है, फिर mantle है, फिर core है. Now crust में outer core, inner core, upper mantle, lower mantle, outer core, inner core. So अभी इसके लिए how are you going to remember these continuities? So there's one mnemonic which is Cm is regular. Now here you have to focus on the letters that are mentioned in capital, right? So the uppercase letters are something that you are supposed to focus on. So CM is basically Chief Minister, and a Chief Minister being at an authoritative position, he needs to be regular. And that is why this statement is something that you can keep in mind, easy to remember. Now let's understand how you can relate it with the names that are there. CM is regular. So here C stands for Conrad, M stands for the Moho discontinuity, regular ka Ray stands for Repetit, U stands for Gutenberg, and the L here stands for Lehman. So the mnemonic CM is regular actually helps you to remember these different discontinuities that exist between the different layers of interior of our earth. So students, in today's video we started with understanding the structure of earth's interior. we studied that our Earth's interior is divided into three main parts: crust, mantle and core. उसके subdivisions भी हम लोगों ने देखे. We saw what exists in each part of these Earth's interior, that is crust में क्या है, mantle का क्या है and core का, and finally we saw the different discontinuities that exist. So with this we come to the end of today's class. I hope you have enjoyed what has been taught in today's video. If you have any doubts, you can post them down in the comment section, and see you soon in the next video. Thank you so much.